Welcome to Chapter 7 video presentation. Chapter 7 is titled The Procurement Management Plan. This video presentation, just like all video presentations in this course, are based on the book titled Procurement Management, Contracting, Subcontracting, Teaming by Quinton Fleming. Upon completing Chapter 7, you should be able to explain why planning procurement is important, discuss the main phases of project procurements together with specific activities that happen in each or every phase. Also, you should be able to list and briefly discuss the three constraints of procurement, explain how procurement scope can be determined, explain why procurement items need to be classified by categories. Also, you should be able to explain how a clearly defined procurement scope can help a project manager avoid such negative phenomena as scope creep. You should be able to list the three critical milestones in a procurement schedule for an item. Also, you should be able to explain how a contract award date can be planned for, explain how a negative float can emerge for a procured item. Also, you should be able to explain how a project manager can eliminate a negative float, also to list and briefly discuss the main budgeting techniques for procurement items. Finally, you should be able to discuss or propose a possible organizational structure for managing various types of procurements, including procurements involving buys of commercial off-the-shelf items, and also for the right organizational structure for organizing or managing procurements related to government funded projects. But first we'll talk about the importance of planning and the importance of planning for procurement in particular. And to explain the importance of planning, I would like to share the following two quotes with you. Just pause this video for a minute, reflect on those quotes, and try to answer the following questions. Why is planning important? So please pause the video now. With these two quotes from President Dwight Eisenhower and Russell Archibald, who is a former executive and well-known management consultant, tell me two things. First of all, in a way, or at least from the perspective of that pure logical argument, plans are worthless in a sense that no single plan can have 100% certainty attached to it. In fact, given the fact that we are living in this social world full of people who are oftentimes irrational and also high-level social processes that really encompass different judgments, different high-level trends, and different microphenomena, it's impossible to predict future with 100% certainty. Okay, just from the perspective of philosophical argument, we can argue that. So on the one hand, plans are worthless, but at the same time, they're essential, they're everything, they're very important for success. I think what happens when you engage yourself in planning for a project, for anything, whether it's in the world of business or in the realm of your own personal life. So when you engage in planning, you're not trying to predict the future with 100% certainty. What you're trying to do, you're trying to make yourself more likely to succeed in whatever you're trying to start. Okay, so planning does not guarantee anything, and that's why Eisenhower probably said that plans are worthless. But it helps you increase the chances of success, or to phrase this in a negative way, reduce risks associated with any kind of endeavor. So without a plan, you're in a more vulnerable situation. You're even more likely to fail with your project or any kind of other endeavor. So this is giving the importance of planning in general and planning for procurements in particular. This is the central message of this chapter. As a project manager, you need to develop a plan and execute it in order to reduce project risks and to continue, this phrase, to rephrase this last part in a positive way, to increase chances of a project success. Now, planning for procurements is not an easy task because there are many phases and activities associated with procurements. So the three phases that we will discuss in this chapter and subsequent chapters are as follows. procurement definition, and procurement definition starts when the project starts. So just when you start creating your project scope, you also need to start thinking about what will be the items of that scope that you will buy from outside. So after you define your procurements, you're ready to issue the so-called request for proposal. This is an official document that goes to vendors or sellers, and in order for vendors to participate in your project, to bid for your business, they need to formally respond for your RFP, request for proposal. So once they formally respond to your request for proposal, you're preoccupied with seller selection. You're trying to select the best proposal, the best vendor, and then based on whatever procedure, formal procedure you have or informal procedure that you have for seller selection, you go ahead and award a contract or contracts to the vendors that are selected for this particular project. After contracts are awarded, it's the time for sellers to perform, in other words, to deliver what they promise in the contract. And then only after the final delivery, when the promised product or service is delivered and all closing procedures are properly carried out, the contract is complete. So as you can see, it's a long, complicated process with several phases, several activities and deliverables, 4 important milestones. So it's very important to plan for this process. From a high-level standpoint, planning for procurements involve answering questions in relation to what you're going to procure, when, at what point of time, and for how much. Those are the most important questions, and also these are often viewed as the 3 constraints of procurement. So next we will talk about some of the issues, techniques, and methodologies that fall into the what, when, and how much constraints. We'll start with the what. Defining what needs to be procured is a very important step. A good starting point for deciding what needs to be procured for a particular project is the so-called work breakdown structure. As you know by now, a work breakdown structure outlines all the items, all the work items that need to be carried out in order to complete a particular project. And when you create that complete list that is a part of your work breakdown structure, you can go one item you can analyze one item at a time to decide which work item will be a make item, meaning you will produce this item internally with your project team, and which item on the work breakdown structure will be the so-called buy item, meaning procured from outside. So the final outcome of this analysis is a comprehensive list of buys of all the products and services that you will be procuring from outside. Once you create a list of buys, it is important to classify those buys, those work items from the work breakdown structure into the following categories that we discussed before: major complexity procurements, minor complexity procurements, routine commercial off-the-shelf item procurements, corporate teaming arrangements, and interdivisional purchasing. So why do we need to classify buys or procurements into those generic 5 categories? Well, the thing is, each category of procurements has different weight and should be managed differently. For example, on a typical project, major complexity and minor complexity procurements will probably constitute 80% of procurement cost, but only 20% of all procured items. On the opposite side of the spectrum, routine commercial off-the-shelf procurements will constitute 80% of the items needed for the project, but only 20% of cost. So using the so-called Pareto principle or golden principle, I think there are many alternative names for this phenomena where it has been observed empirically that 80% of results come from 20% of activities or efforts. So using this Pareto principle, naturally you will devote most of the attention and most of the resources to this group, right? Because it constitutes 80% of procurement cost. And probably less attention, less resources will go to the second group, involving routine commercial off-the-shelf procurements. Although this group is quite numerous, it represents 80% of all procured items. It's not that important from a financial standpoint because it represents only 20% of all costs. So critical procurement should be assigned to responsible parties as soon as possible, It's a good idea to include both technical, meaning people like engineers, IT professionals, and also non-technical specialists, for example, procurement managers, contracting officers, etc. So both categories of staff should be assigned to each critical procurement. Now, some additional issues in determining what to procure requires looking forward at some of the other constraints, such as when and how much. So some of the additional issues to consider as follows. When does the project manager need a complete and detailed technical description? So if the need is urgent, then maybe you cannot buy something that is complex. You will go ahead and buy something that is simpler, right? Also, when is a model contract needed? What type of contractual arrangements will work best? When an RFP is needed? So all those forward-looking questions may influence your list of what you're planning to procure, because they also take into account the complexity, possible price, and also the timeline. Now, all those considerations can be captured in a project procurement matrix. We'll leave it for now, but basically it's a table that lists procurements, and then as columns you have all those other additional dimensions, in relation to deadlines, budgets, and stuff like that, to create a full visualization of all procurement items, and also related variables or related issues that are important for each of the procurement items. So yeah, overall, defining project procurement scope, meaning clearly defining what needs to be bought, is essential. It is very important. One thing that it will help you with is to reduce the risks associated with the so-called scope creep phenomena, where the list of procurement items keeps growing to the point where the project becomes too complex and too hard to manage. And this is one of the most frequently cited factors behind project failure, when the list of work items, whether internal or external, keeps growing. When they keep growing, the complexity of the project grows as well, and then the management complexity, the administrative overhead, also starts to grow exponentially. So this is one of the biggest failure factors behind projects. But if you're clear in defining your project procurement scope, what exactly you'll be procuring, then you're less likely to experience the scope creep phenomena. Because if somebody comes from outside of your project, let's say somebody from another department, or a manager, a top manager, senior manager, who was not a part of the project committee in the beginning, and ask you to change something, to modify something, or add something to your project procurement scope, then you can use this project scope to say that, look, this is what was agreed upon initially. We cannot expand the scope because otherwise the project will grow in complexity. Maybe it's possible to increase the scope, but that will require often will require an exponential increase in resources devoted to this project. So this is something that keeps everybody on the same page with respect to the size of the project, and specifically the size of the procurement portion of the project. So next we will talk about scheduling. It's the next critical step and it's the next critical constraint, and it involves deciding when each procurement has to be made to support the project's master schedule. Not being able to procure the needed items on time is one of the biggest or common project risks. When you look at each of the procurement items, you need to look at three critical milestones. Number one, when contract is awarded to a seller. Then the second important, I wouldn't say milestone, but a period, is seller's performance, lead time. So once a contract is awarded, the seller will go ahead and perform in accordance with the items agreed upon in a contract. And then the third critical point or milestone is delivery date based on the project's master schedule. So visually it will look something like this. You have your overall project master schedule. You can think of it as a Gantt chart. And then there are certain procurement items that need to be delivered at certain points in order to avoid any delays in the project master schedule. Now, before a particular item is delivered, you also need to take into account the seller performance time. So after a contract for a particular procurement item is awarded, the seller needs time to perform, to deliver on the contract. So this is how procurement items schematically fit within the overall project schedule. Now, sometimes it's very difficult to award contracts on time due to technical, but I would say more often administrative issues, when there's some politics involved, or there's simple bureaucracy where you need to comply with a number of regulations, policies, and rules to actually award the contract to somebody. I know that things are especially complicated in the government sector where the regulations seem to be more stringent and more numerous. So all those things can delay the contract award date beyond the point that is needed to make sure that the overall project master schedule is running smoothly. So some project managers attempt to cut corners to produce the required items on time. For example, instead of signing a real contract, they will issue a letter contract, which is really like an MOU, a memorandum of understanding. It's not it may not be a legally binding document because it may not have any specifics as to how you will cooperate with the vendor. Now that may seem a good idea to issue like a simplified form of a contract, but this can also be quite costly because some unethical sellers, they may quickly sense that you're under time pressure, that you're trying to get things done quickly, and they understand that you're trying to cut corners. So when the time comes to negotiate certain things, or when a dispute arises between you and the seller, they might take advantage of the situation, knowing that they haven't signed a legally binding contract, or they signed a contract that has a lot of ambiguities due to the time constraints that were present at the time the contract was signed. So to avoid additional cost, you need to plan for contract award date as well. And one of the ways to think about contract award dates and to plan for those dates is to think in terms of the following milestones: today's date, how long it will take you to issue an RFP, request for proposal, and also when after this RFP issue, when you can possibly award the contract. So schematically, it will look something like this. So walking backwards, before you award the contract, you need to issue an RFP. So your potential sellers will respond to your RFP, and this is when you'll formally evaluate those proposals. We'll talk about what happens between an RFP issue and a contract award on the next slide. But before an RFP is issued, you need some time to prepare the so-called solicitation package. Those are the typical items that go into an RFP. So to plan for a contract award date, you need to work backwards from today's date. All the way back to today's date, and or forward from today's date to the desired contract award date, to see whether you have enough time to develop an RFP and then to process responses to RFP and actually award the contract. Because a lot of things go in between milestone 1 and 2 and 2 and 3. So here in this slide we'll look at the breakdown of tasks or phases that happen between an RFP is issued and a contract is actually awarded. So to issue an RFP, you need to prepare a proposal, and once this proposal is issued, then sellers, they need some time to prepare a response to this proposal, right? So you issue an RFP, and then sellers need some time to respond to it. So this is the time when they respond to your RFP with a formal proposal. After that, you as the organization that carries out the project, you will formally evaluate proposals from vendors based on a number of dimensions. Then you will select a source, one single vendor or group of vendors. Then this will require your vendor selection has to be approved by management. And this is a very tricky part. This is where a lot of projects or procurement arrangements get killed, because in many organizations, top management has the right to reject contracts, and it may take anything from one day, when top management simply approves your selection, or sometimes it takes longer when a top manager wants to think about it or discuss it with other people before making a final decision. So all this shows that a lot of steps, a lot of activities, a lot of phases go in between issuance of an RFP and the actual award date. Again, this can be a tricky step. A lot of project managers think that this is the easiest step, because once everything is selected, you just need 5 minutes to get a signature from top management. But in reality, it can be more complicated than that. Now, sometimes when you do this kind of forward or backward analysis, you see that the time when the contract needs to be awarded, let's say this point of time, and this point of time is dictated by the delivery date, the date that needs to be there, so that your overall project master schedule is running smoothly. So sometimes when you need to award the contract and when you can award the contract are two different dates, so they're not the same. And if that's the case, when the date when you can award the contract is way after when you need this contract to be awarded, you have the so-called negative float situation where simply put, you don't have enough time to properly award the contract. So what should you do? If there's not enough time to award the contract with proper mechanisms in place, the procurement cycle can be shortened significantly to eliminate that negative float by making sellers of a critical procurement item a part of the project team. So in other words, you're not inviting potential sellers or vendors to bid on your project. You make a vendor selection from the very beginning, from the very start of the project, and you put this vendor, this seller, to be a part of your project team, so that from the very beginning the seller is on the same page, they know what you're working on, and they know what needs to be delivered for your project. So doing that will certainly eliminate the competition for the selected seller, so there will be no competition. You will select the seller early on. Now, of course, this has some cons and pros. The pro is that less time is needed you don't need time to evaluate alternative vendors. The con, the disadvantage, is that you have a less competitive quality price deal. If you're not asking vendors to bid for your business, you may not get a good deal. In some industries, in some organizations, this is outright illegal, not to subject certain procurement requests to competitive bidding. Especially this happens in the government, in the public sector. It's usually a requirement, unless it's something secret or something that is a matter of national interest. There will be no public announcement of those projects. But in most public organizations, it's a requirement that contracts need to be advertised and bids needs to be solicited from a number of vendors. However, despite those cons, many companies actually go with this option. They actually practice this kind of approach to procurement. I think one notable example of an industry or group of companies practicing that would be Japanese auto manufacturers. Now, of course, there are always exceptions from this rule, but for a long time, unlike US manufacturers that were all about open bidding and trying to use open bidding to lower prices of their vehicles, Japanese auto manufacturers had a different approach. They worked with a lot of vendors as families, so they had this kind of interpersonal, relative-like relationship with those vendors that supply parts to Toyota, to Nissan. And I remember a quote, I think it was from a Toyota, or maybe I forgot which Japanese auto executive, but he said something like that, referring to U.S. auto manufacturers. He said something like, to get a precision of let's say 1/10 of a millimeter, he was talking about parts, right? So he said to get a precision of 1/10 of a millimeter, you can use competitive bidding, but to get precision of within 100th or 1,000th of a millimeter, you cannot have competitive bidding. You need to have a family-like relationship with your vendor, where they understand that precision on their side is your success, and your success is also their success as a vendor. So it's not like a either or. Some companies, it's not like a bad or good approach. Some companies have different philosophies, and they practice different approaches with various degrees of success. So this is what's happening schematically when you try to shorten the procurement cycle. So instead of defining your procurement and going through the procurement process, you make a particular vendor a part of your team early on. At the time the project scope is defined, so the vendor will work together with you on procurement definition, and then by the time the procurement definition phase is over, they will go ahead and deliver deliver the items or services that are defined in the procurement scope. So this whole procurement process phase will be eliminated, and the delivery phase can be The delivery point can be much earlier than if you engaged in the formal procurement process. So the final constraint we'll discuss is budgeting. So how do we budget for things? There are several approaches to budgeting. One simple approach is analogy or rule of thumb. Those are top-down estimates based on similar projects and maybe with some input from experts. So you say, well, in the past it costed X dollars to procure a similar part, a similar service. So we believe that it will cost us X plus 5%, something like that. Parametric modeling are more sophisticated techniques based on mathematical stochastic models where you insert a bunch of parameters and each parameter has certain probability attached to it, and based on those parameters you'll get a financial estimate for a product or service. Now also you have bottom-up estimates where you provide detailed estimates for smaller individual work packages and then you aggregate it together to a final amount. Now all those approaches are often assisted with computerized estimating tools. Or sometimes it's done, the budgeting is done using firm proposals from viable sellers. They will just give you the price and they will say, well, this is the price, this is a breakdown. So this will eliminate the need on your side to think about budgeting how much a particular item should cost. At the end of this video presentation, we'll talk about some other important issues in procurement planning related to procurement organization and staffing. Procurement is often organized nowadays with material resource planning systems or MRPs. Those systems are often a part of a bigger enterprise resource planning system such as SAP or PeopleSoft if we're talking about education. So what those MRP systems or modules do, they get your project requirements as an input, and those requirements are usually physical items because a lot of those MRP systems, they're geared towards manufacturing industries. So you get your product requirements in terms of parts, and then the system will work backwards. It will break down those parts into components, and then it will schedule, it will price, it will budget those components, and even automatically issue requests and messages for vendors that can deliver those parts. Now, while MRPs can be quite effective, in fact, they can be good for up to 90% of items used in a particular project, they often stumble when high value, high complexity procurements are made. Something that is highly complex and something that has never been done before and something that costs a lot of money. So if that's the case, if you do have those high value, high complexity procurements, then MRP may not be of much help when it comes to in relation to administrative oversight. So you may want to form separate teams to manage those high value, high complexity procurements. So this is one way to arrange it. For example, under the project manager, you'll have sub-teams devoted to teaming contract A, major complexity by B, and then you'll have a separate sub-team responsible for minor complexity procurements, and then you have a team responsible for managing, let's say, high volume commercial off-the-shelf items through an MRP or ERP or website. And then naturally, you will have people from the procurement side, from the office of procurement participating in those teams to offer support from the business side of things, such as contracting, compliance with legal regulations, compliance with internal procedures. So you will include those people as well. So this is one way to organize your team for specific categories of procurements. Especially this organization can be important for government-funded projects because a lot of government-funded projects, they often require compliance with certain regulations that that are meant to accomplish certain social goals to improve the welfare of the overall community. For example, on all government-funded projects contracting from small business owners that fall into such categories as veterans, women, disadvantaged businesses, they must be encouraged, they must be given preferences. So there can be additional oversight and paperwork involved when you're dealing with government-funded projects. So that's why you need to have maybe additional team members responsible for handling bids from those small business to comply with all government regulations. So this is where a lot of attention is needed. Now, a few other thoughts on excluding competition. Usually buyers like competition. There's a saying among economists and managers that goes something like, when companies compete, consumers or buyers win. When companies compete, they have to invest time, money, and overall attention into improving their price quality combination so that they're chosen over competitors. So this is something that helps consumers benefit, and some economists would argue benefits the entire society as a whole. So this is this invisible hand of the free market that regulates things and channels resources into the most promising products, companies, and industries. But of course, it's not the case all the time. Free market, free competition does not work all the time. Sometimes there are very legitimate reasons not to have any competition among sellers. And those situations typically fall into two categories. You have sole source procurements, when only one seller is available. Let's say the seller that you have is a natural monopoly, and as a company you have nowhere else to go but to deal with this vendor. Or sometimes it's a situation of a single source procurement where there are many sellers available, but for business reasons you choose to go with one particular vendor. To give you an example of each, for example, in the UAE where I live, there was only one telecommunication provider. Why there was one telecommunication provider, it's a long story. One justification was that the country was small, there was no room for several telecommunication providers. The other argument was that it was like a social organization that provided employment to citizens and provided revenues for the government, because in the UAE there's no tax. There's no individual tax. There's no business tax too, but that business tax was masked as licenses, permits, and stuff like that. So it was like a source for government revenues as well. So that's why it was a government-owned telecommunication provider. So as a business owner, if you wanted, let's say, to open a small business and purchase a point-of-sale terminal, there's only one vendor you had to deal with, which was Etisalat, right? Sometimes a single source procurement is carried out for business reasons. For a long time in the business world, there was this saying that I'm sure IBM liked very much, that you cannot go wrong with IBM. So a lot of companies would say, yeah, IBM is pricey, but they've been around for decades. We cannot go wrong with them. We may overpay, but we will never fail. So they would go ahead and deal with IBM or any other major IT vendor such as Microsoft, thinking that they're saving time, money, and headache in the long run, although they may be overpaying in the short run. So there are some situations where competition may not make that much sense. Now, some issues related to preliminary contract selection. If there are only routine purchases based on firm fixed price contracts, then there's not much there's not much to think about. You just get a contract template, you modify it for this particular vendor, and you are done. But you need to keep in mind that any departure from a routine firm fixed price contract, even very minor ones, such as, let's say, paying a vendor not in a lump sum, but over over a certain period of time. So even a minor deviation from like that, and I can tell from my own experience, can add a lot of administrative overhead, a lot of headache to you as a project manager. So any kind of departure, even minor one, needs to be carefully evaluated. And even if this departure is minor, it may still require top management involvement and all kinds of other departments. They need to approve this minor deviation from a standard contract template. Now, some reflections as to who needs to manage critical procurements. The most important point here is that somebody needs to be in charge. When nobody is in charge, in the absence of a specific person in charge, the vendor may play mind games. They may basically go from one party to another, saying, "Oh, this party said that. What do you think?" And they will play those mind games to get a higher price for themselves, to make more money from the deal. So somebody needs to be in charge. Ideally, it has to be a cross-functional team that has a variety of expertise. So this cross-functional team should involve the purchasing manager, engineers or technical professionals, and the project manager, because ultimately it's the project manager responsible for the overall success of the project. A prenup agreement is recommended to clearly specify who is in charge, who makes the final decision, and what are the areas of people's authority and expertise. So, for example, it can be agreed upon that when it comes to contracting, legal, and business matters, purchasing manager has the final say. When it comes to technical matters, it is the engineers or technical professionals who have the final say. And when it comes to the final approval of a procurement, then it's the project manager who has the ultimate say. Because at the end, the procurement is done for his or her project, and this person, the project manager, is ultimately in charge for the success of the project. So this prenup agreement will outline those areas of responsibilities and authority. Now, also you need to keep in mind that procurement are often guided by policies, procedures, and practices within the company. All three must be supportive of procurement. Sometimes buying even a small item requires creating an absolutely different or new procurement infrastructure. So that will require redefining or creating new policies, procedures, and practices from scratch. So you need to understand that if you're trying to buy something in an environment that doesn't have policies, procedures, and practices supportive for procurement, you have to build this entire procurement infrastructure, even if you're trying to buy something small and minor. Another important issue is team building. The thing is, no matter how much planning is done, there still may be gaps, something that you haven't planned for. Those gaps are especially problematic in virtual teams when people work remotely. So to make your project procurement teams effective in handling those gaps or unforeseen situation, you need to do some team building, both formally and informally. You need to invite people together and maybe do some exercises, do some fun activities where they find out more about each other's job titles, responsibilities, and also personalities, so that the relationship is based on trust. It's based on mutual affinity and sympathy as opposed to formal lines, because all those formal and informal team building and team training, it helps resolve difficult situations, something that you haven't planned for when those situations arise. Now at the end, we'll quickly mention other important issues that are important for planning, and those issues involve risk assessment. So how risky a particular procurement item or procurement sub-project is. Also, post-contract award management approach. So once you award a contract to a particular vendor, naturally you want to have some degree of oversight as to what the vendor is doing. The vendor may not like it. They will say, well, it's none of your business how we are doing. We don't want anybody snooping around. So that's an important area to think about. So what are you going to do? How are you going to monitor seller performance once a contract is awarded? Also, something that helps manage projects in general and procurements in particular are management displays, like a war room, meaning a physical space devoted to a project where documents are properly organized or displayed. I think nowadays it's more common to have a website that stores all this information. And lastly, but this is by no means a minor issue, ensuring procurement plan buy-in from management. As I mentioned before, in many organizations, top management has the authority to reject or approve procurement plans, procurement proposals, and if there are some high-level political reasons issues arising, then top management may reject a particular procurement plan, no matter how much time and resources you have put into it. So maybe it's a good idea to keep top management with authority to approve or reject procurement plans on board from the very beginning. Otherwise, you may be up for some unpleasant surprises at the end. So that completes our video presentation on Chapter 7.